Hi, Nana. So, what we have here is a very special gift for your very special 85th birthday, created by your children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. Happy birthday. We love you.
Sitting in the Rain by Jacob Saylor. It was raining, hard, and cold droplets the size of a dime, plopping probably thousands a second against the hard casing of the bus stop roof. Naturally, whoever had designed it had done so in the typical half-assed manner of most inner-city agencies, because it failed to completely cover the seat and the occupant by a good 3 or 4 inches. Not enough for them to notice it, apparently, but enough for its occupant as the rain poured on and made his hat crumple under the weight and the coat to be soaked through. With a curse, he glared up at the unsympathetic gray overcast that seemed determined to make his day worse. Because of course it would. Everything that morning was practically in a waiting list to do exact that. He couldn't even put some life back into himself with a smoke, as the packaging had lost its plastic and its contents soaked through. Part of him wanted to just stand up and get on top of the seat, so he'd at least have some cover that way, but some masochistic part of him told him that wouldn't be proper. Better to suffer than look silly, it said. Yeah, thanks for that, he hissed through clenched teeth, noting the pole clock to his right. And thanks for being 30 minutes late, you son of a... Dreadful weather we're having, he suddenly heard to his left, seeing an average-looking man in an overcoat, a brim hat, and with a face you'd probably find in the reception desk of a hotel, trying too hard to be respectable. He shook his head. No, more like a dust-filled bookstore trying not to accept the reality its style went out 20 years ago. His cheerful demeanor strangely put him firmly in the sour gauge, and the fact he had an umbrella made it worse. He grunted and shrugged, the man taking a seat next to him with the umbrella covering them both. While he didn't like how close the old-timer was sitting next to him, he did appreciate not being wet. Or more wet, he supposed. Thanks, he mumbled, feeling the inclination to go for the pack in his coat despite knowing it was soaked through. To his surprise, it was bone dry. He shook his head at that, already thinking he was at the halfway point of marvelousness. Shame. He left his lighter in his... Flick, he heard, seeing the man draw his own lighter, silver-pressed and beamed. Mind if I join you? He asked in that overly optimistic voice that radiated in a busybody tone. Sure, drawing two of them from the pack and motioning him to come closer. For a minute, or what seemed a minute, they smoked in silence. Then, dreadful weather we're having. You said that. I did? Oh, yes, I did. My memory's a funny thing, I suppose. Where are you heading? In town. Oh, really? Same here. Though maybe a different time than you. Though it seems like yours is late. Might need to hop the same one, maybe? He shrugged again, not saying, I hope not. Mind if I ask where you're heading? He asked. I do mind, he replied, turning to him. Not exactly in the mood for heart singing, so... I'll go first then, his grin getting longer as he interrupted him. Here to visit my sons. It's a little get-together, I suppose you could say. Ah, the four of them. Such rascals. But I love them fondly. Four? He found himself asking aloud. Not really picture this bow-tied librarian and all but name being the father type. Oh, yes, four. Used to run a family business years ago. Well, my sons do. I just garden and read. Occasionally might make decisions, but things are so well managed I rarely need to pop my head. He took a draw. Then why a get-together? Sounds like you'd see him all the time. Well, he shifted uncomfortably. It's my youngest, you see. I love him fondly, but we had such a terrible falling out. At the time, I thought kicking him out would do him a right lesson, learn as I had, but now, well, all I want is him back. I suppose you could say, he beamed again. And a little get-together is just the ticket, I'd said. I don't know. Those things kind of rarely are, just the ticket. He shot him an odd look. You are quite the down person, aren't you? Just realistic. Life is that way. No other way to view it. I disagree, the old man chuckled. Living life that way leaves you with nothing to look forward to. Nothing to give any semblance of joy, in my frank opinion. And you clearly haven't been beat down enough, he muttered, avoiding taking the obvious jab on the topic of his son. Why wouldn't this man just go away and... Oh dear, I think you dropped this. He turned, finding the tickets that had been in his pocket now in the old man's hand. With a suppressed hiss, he snatched them from the old fool and shoved them back in his pocket. He wanted to storm off then. To hell with waiting. He'd just walk. But the hurt expression on the old man's face, complete with a hand on his heart, gave him pause. Sorry, he muttered, sitting back on his chair. Just personal thing, I suppose. I can see that, the old man nodded. And I'd say you're going to meet someone too. Someone you... He let the question hang, and he shrugged. My fault, all my fault. Tried so hard to make things work, and all I did was push her away, he found himself saying without realizing. Why was he saying these things? It's all dead. Don't even know why I'm going, he continued darkly. Might as well bring a shovel while I'm at it. He felt a hand on his, turning to find him sympathetically poised, and he realized what his face had reminded him of. One of those old top hat dolls with the red cheeks and nutcracker smiles. He really then started to question his sanity when he interrupted those stewings with a dead serious tone, devoid of the cheer prior. Nothing is ever truly dead, my son. We all have, in our time, second and third and even fourth chances to make things right. It's all about one being willing to make the first step in the tango, I suppose you could say. What if she doesn't want to tango? He grinned. Oh, she will. I can assure you of that. No one really is as heartless as you may think. Oh, sure, we're all hurt inside, and that can make us do truly... His paused, his mind somewhere else before chuckled and shook his head. All it takes is that first step, and then one after the other. He laughed despite himself. Please don't start singing. The old man looked at him, confused, then realized what he'd meant and joined him. Well, I certainly am not wearing enough red for that. But was he wrong there? Change is all about one foot in front of... Don't do it, he jutted a finger at him, grinning. Don't do it! The other, and soon you'll be... Oh, come on! He playfully shrieked, earning more contagious laughter that stretched on a good minute or so. When he got back control of his lungs, he asked, So you really think so? Yes, he shrugged. We really are that simple, really. Oh, we're capable of good and bad, but in the end, all we wanted to be is together. It just takes that first step. Then I'd say your son is in good hands, I think, he replied, nodding. Then he heard a noise and saw the silver outlining of the bus coming in from the side street. I think our ride's... He was gone, and he was holding his umbrella. He looked around, not seeing where in the blazes he could have gotten. It was still raining. He would have heard the splashing of him walking away. But he was gone, leaving the dry imprint slowly being filled of where he'd been sitting just a few seconds prior. He heard doves, or pigeons or whatever, flying and scurrying. Then as the bus pulled in front of him, the door swinging open. Need a lift? The operator asked. Yeah, I guess I do.
Next, we have a collective writing from several family members. This is part 1. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. or so it seemed. In England, a king who had ruled over the United Kingdom and all its sometimes grumpy countries had died, and his son, who would never be crowned, took his place, later to relinquish it with relief to his much less relieved brother, who stuttered badly and had to take lessons to enable him to make the speeches demanded by his subjects. In Germany, the latest of a long line of European dictators had ascended with seemingly lightning speed to complete power, bringing his evil ways with him. This same dictator and his sycophants would be stumped and infuriated when a black American track star swept aside world records and scored a number of gold medals at the Olympics they hosted, insulting their ideas of white supremacy. Of course, the black American track star, despite initiating a long lineage of others to come, was basically ignored by the president of his own country. But we digress. It is history, though. Look it up. In other European countries, people watched Germany nervously, and other dictators either cast in their lot with the German one or waited to see which side they should be on. At least a few of them did. And in Japan, the latest in military advancements and famous Japanese ability to band together were creating yet another fascist threat. In Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, and many other countries, hopes were high they might not have to get into the war that was definitely brewing. The vast African continent, overtaken by many European conquests, had enough to deal with. However, all of them would be yanked, screaming, kicking, and sometimes biting. You're capable of a lot when you're being dragged somewhere you don't want to go, if necessary, into the mess. But right now we care nothing of these consequences. As the Scarlet Pimpernel would say, how little we care for them, for they are not the stars of our story. Instead, the star of our story is a tiny baby born to a woman of Irish and other extraction who taught kindergarten, and a man from Wales by way of Canada who worked for the electric company in the United States, where FDR had the Great Depression on the run and people might believe all would be well forever. The baby girl, when her eyes stopped being blue, they would be hazel, always and forever. Amen. And onward the story goes in part 2.
The little girl grew up in a nice little town. In her backyard, there was a big tree. This was not just any tree, and it was not just big. It was a talking tree, and it had dreams of being as big as a sequoia. The little girl loved the tree and went out to visit it and talked to it often. She told it all of her dreams and played make-believe with it until one day it talked back. The tree told the girl that she was special.
You're special.
She was so special, in fact, that he had decided to let her in on the big secret. All the trees could talk.
All the trees can talk.
They didn't usually bother talking to humans because most humans were boring and wouldn't take the time to get to know a tree. But the little girl was different. For many months, the girl continued to visit the tree just as before, but she and the tree had long conversations and made up stories together and talked about what the clouds looked like or what their favorite foods were. The girl loved ice cream, and the tree loved really good dirt. Then one day in the winter, when most of the other trees had gone to sleep and shed their leaves, her tree told her that he needed her help.
I need your help.
She was the only one who could save the trees in the town, but that means she'd have to have an adventure. And that's adventure with a capital A. which means it was especially important.
It's important.
Not adventures with a lowercase a, which is like when the little girl would walk down the block to her grandparents' house. There was one catch. Once the girl had successfully finished her adventure and saved the trees in her town, she would forget all about it. She would even forget trees could talk. The trees would always love her and be her friends, but they would never talk to her again. The little girl took a moment to think appropriately hard about this and decided that of course she would do it, because the trees were her friends and she wanted to save them.
And now our story continues in part 3.
Go before the High Council of the town and convince them to preserve our forest. You must also convince them to include planting more trees and further development and building they wish to do. For you see, the High Council was eager to grow the town into a small city. They had begun clear-cutting portions of the forest, the newest parts, to make room for new roads and buildings and homes. This was despite a wealth of unforested land already within the town's limits that was so far unincorporated. As they built, they were also eliminating any green space, which made these new pockets of development harsh and unwelcoming in many ways. The oldest trees understood the need for growth, but also saw what the High Council could not. They were creating an inhospitable environment that would not attract the type of industry and growth they craved, not to mention the threat to the forest. As the grown people got farther from nature, the less they understood it and the role it played in their lives. Many were becoming hard, distant, and unkind. The little girl saw this too. It made her sad, a bit angry, and also a bit scared. I will do it, though I know not how, for I am but a child. Fear not, Titan the tree said. You are mighty in heart and soul. You have not lost your innocence and wonder, which would allow you to see the nature as she truly is. Besides, I was once a seedling myself. We all were, said Titan, swinging his branches in gesture to his surrounding sister and brothers. There is much power in numbers, and you have many friends who also love to play among us and climb our branches, sleep in our arms, and gather beneath our canopies. This planted a seed in the little girl's mind. My friends, she whispered to herself. And thus began the great nature project that saved the trees and the town. Little girl remembered she had an oral report coming due soon in school and had not yet picked a topic. She knew this would be it. Over the course of the next weeks, the little girl researched the importance and impact that trees, flora, and fauna had on the world around her, how it helped clean the air, reduce soil erosion, and increase water retention in the soil, how it helped maintain a more comfortable temperature even within the small town center that still had very old, very tall trees, not yet ripped out for the sake of progress. As she researched, she began talking to her friends, who talked to their friends, and so on, slowly but steadily recruiting them to help with her grand plan to go before the High Council. As she grew her army of innocence and wonder, the little girl's own strength and confidence in the mission grew. Her oral report in school was so inspiring, the teacher was moved to tears, and the entire school gave her a standing ovation. Her teacher, whose husband sat on the High Council, but was often at odds with other members over how the town should develop. See, he loved the trees too. Convinced him to get the little girl and her presentation on the agenda for the next meeting. The day before she was to speak to the High Council, she was visited by Titan. This time it was spring, and the forest was beginning to awaken. But Titan looked tired and sad. Concerned, the little girl asked, "My dearest friend, what is it that saddens you so?" Titan simply lowered one of his branches and pointed to a red X sprayed upon his trunk. He then pointed to the rest of the trees around him. They, too, bore the mark. They were targeted for clear cutting. Titan looked down at the little girl, lowering his branch, and with the softest sweep of new leaves, touched her cheek. "Kathleen, I fear it is too late. They are coming for us." He closed his eyes and spoke no more. Kathleen threw her arms around his trunk as far as they would go. Crying, she vowed to make it stop. They stood together then, in silence, for a long time. Her tears dried, and leaving salty trails down her face, Kathleen finally pulled away. "I will not let this come to be. Not now, not ever." Her dreams that night were fraught with images of biting, gnawing, sawing, angry machines attacking the forest. That day, as she approached the podium to speak to the High Council, she stood straight as a rod and knew everything depended on her. Kathleen presented with such conviction, even the High Council president, a mean man with a pinched face, listened closely. And then she gave her closing. "If you continue to clear-cut the forest, if you continue to build without including green space, you will create a world that we, the children, cannot live in. We will leave and you will have no one to lead the future." The High Council president laughed out loud and mocked her. "You? You are nothing but a little girl. Who would care for you and feed you?" Suddenly there was a commotion in the audience. While she was speaking, all the children in the town had quietly entered the High Council chambers and stood in the background. They all stepped forward and said in unison, We will care for each other." It was the army of innocence and wonder. They outnumbered the town's grown people, and they were prepared to move out and start their own community. For during all these months, their ranks had grown, and they had surreptitiously been building shelters and creating caches of food and supplies. Plus, they were far superior to the grown people when using technology, and had already created a global network of children now mobilizing to do the same. The High Council sat in shocked silence. It was then some of the children's parents slowly started to stand from their seats and move into the ranks of the army. Many of the town's grown people felt the same way as Kathleen and the other children. They had just forgotten it over time and being battered down by the drumbeat of progress. Kathleen's mother and father moved to stand by her side. Kathleen stepped down from the podium and walked up to the High Council dais. Tilting her head upward, looking the High Council president square in the eye, she quietly said, "So you see, it is to your advantage to re-embrace nature. After all, she loves you, too." His mouth twitched, his eyes filled with tears, and his face crumbled. "I miss nature," he said, and then hung his head in defeat. The next day, all the townspeople gathered in the heart of the forest to scrub away the ugly red X's on the oldest trees. When no one was looking, Titan smiled at Kathleen and hugged her back. "Thank you," he whispered, his leaves rustling just enough to cover the sound. She hugged him tight, whispered she loved him, and vowed silently to remember this adventure only.
Part 4. Kathleen forgot that once the adventure to save her statuesque leafy friends was successfully concluded, her memory of the adventure would fade, as would her ability to converse with the trees. Soon after the adventure, Kathleen's parents had to move her family to a new little town. This town had different kinds of trees, prickly and without shade, and definitely not huggable. Many of them were as old as Titan had been, but they did not multiply as easily. They didn't grow as fast or as tall, and they definitely didn't like to be transplanted to different locations. While they did indeed seem to be ancient, theirs was a stodgy oldness, not as graceful and regal as Titan's forest, and Kathleen had never heard them whisper, even though the wind blew all the time in this little town. Kathleen missed the cool shade and comfort of climbing Titan's branches and daydreaming about life. But she was older now and very busy. She didn't really have time for tree climbing and daydreaming anyway. She loved to read, draw, and color, and write and sing. She also decided to teach herself to cook and clean to help her mother, who was a kindergarten teacher, had very little time and energy left at the end of the day to cook for the family. Kathleen's little brother, Tommy, was especially fond of Kathleen's cooking and remembered it always, even when he grew up and had a family of his own. Kathleen was very good at teaching herself how to do things, and she worked hard at learning new skills. She learned to sew and iron and made a lot of her clothes. Kathleen made good friends in the little town, including a boy who seemed to be the big man on campus. His name was Terry, even though Terry was the BMOC. He actually wasn't very big, but he was pretty tough. He was brave and fast and strong and kind of a smart aleck. He was also pretty athletic. He played every sport in school and he could swim faster than most of the boys. Since he had lived his life in this little town since he was born, Terry knew most everyone and he came from a family with a lot of boys. Kathleen sort of admired him. They were in the same grade, but when they finished junior high, that's when they used to call 7th and 8th grade. But now it's middle school. Terry went to high school far away, and Kathleen and her other friends went to high school in town. Kathleen and Terry didn't see each other very often for 4 years, except sometimes at church on Sundays. Kathleen had lots of fun in high school. She enjoyed going to the football games and really liked to dance. She was a good dancer. But still, she didn't have a lot of time to dream about life, and climbing prickly trees was not a good idea because the tree bark was like thick, sharp needles that could tear your clothes. Kathleen always took good care of her clothes, and tearing them by climbing prickly trees was not something she wanted to do. After Kathleen graduated from the high school in town, and Terry graduated from the faraway high school, he was home for a visit, and it just worked out that they were both at a dance at the same time. The dance was sponsored by the Joshuans. That was a club for young people at the church both their families attended, and also the name of the prickly trees, the Joshua tree. Terry asked Kathleen to dance, and I think that was when they both realized they liked each other quite a bit. Terry wanted to design buildings, and Kathleen wanted to be an artist. Terry traveled very far away to a special university to learn how to be a civil engineer, and Kathleen went to the local college, where she earned her associate's degree. Their relationship grew, and they decided to get married. As a young woman, Kathleen had come to realize that more than anything, she wanted to be a mother. She still loved to draw and paint, but having children was as important to her as being Terry's wife. So Kathleen and Terry had 5 children, 4 girls and 1 boy, and Kathleen was very busy for a long time in her little family's world. She taught her children, all 5 of them, how to bake cookies and make spaghetti sauce, even though her daughters made their spaghetti sauce way better than her son. He disagrees about this, but the sisters say he's wrong. And she made sure they all knew how to wash their clothes and clean their rooms. Most of all, Kathleen and Terry taught their children to be independent, to work hard, to care for each other, to help those in need, and to stand up for what they believed in. Kathleen didn't remember her big adventure with the trees, but in her heart she knew that it was important to stand up for things that mattered, even if standing up was not the popular thing to do. Kathleen and Terry lived in many places as their family grew, but the place they lived the longest and had many big trees with lush green leaves and big strong branches that were perfectly suited to holding Kathleen's children when they wanted to climb and dream about life. And even though these trees were really far away from Titan and his forest family, the new trees had learned through the grapevine. Grapes aren't the only ones who share information, but they did get the corner on calling it a grapevine. It sounds better than tree vine. That Kathleen had saved Titan's forest family many years before. To honor Kathleen's famous adventure, the trees at Kathleen and Terry's home took very good care of the 5 children. None of them ever broke a leg or an arm or a head if they fell out of any of the trees. The children had many of their own made-up adventures in the trees, but Kathleen still had some adventures of her own waiting for her.
After Kathleen and Terry's children had grown strong like the trees and ventured out into the world in pursuit of their own things that mattered, there was a period of quiet in the home with many trees. The beautiful valley was changing, as things are wont to do, and Kathleen devoted her time to her art, her family, and her music. Kathleen made exquisite dolls, and some of them brought life to the dreams she had of mischievous forest spirits, friendly trees, and starry-eyed explorers who always believed in magic and wonder. Through it all, the trees watched over their protector and ensured a breeze was always available to her. The breeze carried Kathleen's love of the trees and the sounds of her beloved music. Paul McCartney always did sound a little better when Kathleen accompanied him, and the trees swayed to their duets in warm afternoons. One day, the breeze carried with it an entirely different sound. The trees carried the message far and wide that Kathleen's valley retreat was echoing with the sound of children's laughter once again. Each passing year seemed to bring more and more of this laughter, and the trees were delighted to have young adventurers in their branches once again. There was music and lightness and oh, so many stories. Kathleen taught all of her grandchildren about nature and the trees and the importance of caring for all living things, even the ones that may be sticky and slimy or have altogether too many legs. The grandchildren visited whenever they could and hugged the trees the same way they would hug Kathleen. Arms wrapped tightly and full of love and goodness and twinkling starlight. Kathleen shared her love of adventure with all she encountered, and eventually, adventure moved Kathleen away from the valley. She touched all her trees and whispered her best wishes to each of them, and the trees stood tall and strong while their leaves wept at her departure. The grapevine was filled with worry and conjecture until finally, the message came through that Kathleen had settled into a new home with beautiful trees and vines. The trees kept tabs on Kathleen and Terry through the grapevine, ensuring that the new trees all knew to rustle a little louder when Terry took a walk in the backyard to surreptitiously munch on an Oreo or two while he thought through his most recent big idea, and that in the fall they needed to bring their best colors to match Kathleen's decorations inside. Kathleen would sit out in the backyard and just listen to the trees and the breeze, and smile at the small birds who would always come to visit. The birds loved how she called them sweet little things, and shared fig Newton crumbs with them. It always made the squirrels jealous, but Kathleen would explain to the squirrels that fig Newtons were not good for them, and the squirrels begrudgingly agreed. After all, this was Kathleen. The years passed, and a new adventure called to Kathleen. She and Terry would be moving further away from the forests she had protected all her life. to a place with less trees and more rocks, a place with a different kind of magic. The California forests wept, but still sent their wishes along with Kathleen and activated the great grapevine to ensure their message made it unchanged to Kathleen's new flora and fauna in New Mexico. Take care of her, for she will always take care of you. This move felt different to Kathleen. It was harder on her heart, but she also knew that New Mexico provided a special outlet for her deep love of the Southwest and her connection to the earth. She settled into her new home with Terry and filled it with love and art and artifacts from her incredible adventures. One day, she sat on the back porch and felt the warmth of the sun on her skin. A green leaf drifted from the tree in the backyard and landed in her lap. She picked it up and twirled it playfully, a small smile spreading across her mouth. She got up and walked over to the tree, gently joking that it appeared to have dropped something as she held the leaf. Kathleen took time to look at the tree, to truly see it, and then caught her breath as she noticed a small tag left by the gentleman who had planted the tree. This tree, so far from the forest she'd gone to battle to protect once upon a time. This tree, so young in its journey. This tree that looked so familiar, but so foreign, was a Titan.
And our final part of the story, part 6.
Kathleen felt drawn to this tree. It made her feel young and excited and a little bit sad. She couldn't put her finger on it, but when she sat next to this sapling, she felt like there was something very important she was forgetting, something that would open up a whole new world for her. While Kathleen had forgotten about her friend Titan, Titan had not forgotten about her. Many years have passed. But for tree folk, a year passes in the blink of an eye. Titan watched the world change and smiled to himself. He wondered what his little friend had been doing all these years. He wanted to see Kathleen. He made up his mind, and when a tree makes up its mind, there is no convincing him otherwise. Many people don't know about the secret lives of trees. You see, when something is around for so long, and yet rooted to one place, they must get creative. Trees were around long before people, and when the earth had lots of visitors. These visitors grew fond of the tall, noble plants and gave each a special gift. Once a century, every tree has the ability to turn into a glorious bark-covered dragon with leaves as wings and branches as great claws. Most tree dragons are not scary, but gentle creatures, simply stretching their roots on a wild night out. Titan had not gone for a flight in a very long time. He knew just where he wanted to go. As the sun slipped behind the horizon, Titan stretched and let out a breath of relief. His great trunk turned and twisted, roots pulled up from long unturned soil, and branches became limbs and claws. He let out a happy howl and leapt into the sky. Titan had developed a very strong bond with Kathleen all those years ago, a bond that would help him to find her now. He soared through the night sky, feeling the wind through his leaves and laughing with delight. He turned his path towards Indiana. He would see if Kathleen wanted to feel the night sky too.
So there's one more thing before we conclude. Happy birthday, Nana. And that's all she wrote.